objectives simply as the ejection of Western forces from the Middle East, and then sometimes they would say the Muslim world, but the core leadership of Al-Qaeda wanted the ejection of Western forces, American, British, French, and that's really what they mean by Western most of the time, from the Middle East. And that's what Bin Laden started out after a period of actually close association with the Saudi ruling family and the U.S. government. What made him go the other way is that he wanted American forces out of Saudi Arabia. ISIS came in with the idea of let's bring back the caliphate and this time, instead of having a Kurdish caliphate, or we will have a real Arab caliphate. But how many people would be willing to have a psychotic character like al-Baghdadi, who was known as a hoodlum in his youth, and really, him and his uncle used to go around beating and robbing, would give their allegiance to someone like that. And even if he was of a high moral character, the number of Muslims that would agree with the notion of the restoration of the caliphate as a political institution rather than as a symbolic spiritual institution I would say that the idea of the restoration of the caliphate as a political entity would, even in theory, even if we do just a purely theoretical empirical study, I would not bet more than 5% of Muslims would agree with. Muslim countries exist within the reality of nation state, and the idea of dissolving boundaries between them. So, for instance, for a country like Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or the Emirates or even Iraq to dissolve boundaries and allow all Muslims to freely come in and partake and share their wealth, so the poorest Muslim can now look for jobs in the areas that have oil and have money. It's something that so it depends on who you're talking to and when and where and so on. So, but ISIS in particular, this notion of ISIS, there is an ideological core to ISIS that says their argument goes as follows, and this is written in a book that's banned all over the Middle East, and maybe that's part of the problem, but it's also banned in the U.S. technically. Although parts of it has been translated, it's classified. A 1,500-page book, and that 1,500-page book by a fellow called Abu Mus'ab al-Suri, which I actually read cover to cover, makes the following argument. He concedes that the vast majority of Muslims would not go for a caliphate at the present time. But he says this is what we would call, his argument of course is in Arabic. He says basically Muslims have a false consciousness. Why do they have a false consciousness? Because Western colonial states forced upon Muslims the idea of nation states, and they have been existing in the reality of nation states for so long they cannot imagine anything different. Now generation after generation after generation have been, So they cannot imagine a political reality without borders, without passports, without uh, the and Abu Musab al-Suri then says that, but there is no hope that Muslims will regain their their righteous sense of. He spends a considerable amount of time saying that the nation state is racist, it's bigoted, it's just completely against Islamic ethics and morality and Islamic law, and then and of course spends a lot of time attacking Muslim theologians who endorse the idea of the Muslim nation state of the nation state. And then he says, but the big problem is that the West will not allow Muslims to regain their true, authentic consciousness. The West, every time Muslims have tried to emerge from their dark ages since colonialism, every time Muslims have tried to get their industry together, they get whatever together, the Western imperialism has intervened by installing puppets that rule, implementing policies that benefit Western industry and Western commerce. And here of course he cites examples like the overthrow of the Mossadegh by the CIA, the attempt to overthrow the Iranian Revolution by the CIA in several now declassified, the Saudi ruling family, which came to power through British, French, British primarily, but it was endorsed by others. So Saudi ruling family, which was brought to power by the British and kept in power by the Americans, because they run their oil policies in a way that keeps our industries working. The imposition of Iraqi rulers, Saddam, was a close ally of the CIA and the U.S. government, and remains so until and he cites numerous examples from all over the world using, what I would say, respectable published sources, mostly declassified memoirs of agents and histories of various so on. And he says, these rulers, their job is to suppress any true spirit of growth or development in the Muslim world, and to keep the Muslim world retarded, backwards, reactionary, so that it would never pose. And then he, of course, cites a lot of Nixon, a lot of Bush, a lot of Condoleezza Rice, a lot of Huntington, all of that about how we are dominant and we must remain dominant, and we must not allow anyone to ever. We must not allow another Soviet Union to exist in any time in the future. So then, third step. So what is the solution? Him and those who basically lifted from his ideas say, well, there's really only one way, and that is to engage the West in a protracted, exhausting war of attrition. The result of this war of attrition is that at the end the West will do two things. Spend, like the Roman Empire, spend its resources on its military forces and its security forces, and take away money from education and development. And so, urban centers will decay further, crime will increase, educational institutions will plummet. Second is that we will force the West to reveal to expose his biggest lie. And according to Abu Musab al-Suri, what is the West's biggest lie? Humanism. That the West basically dominated the world by claiming that it cares about the human being first and foremost. And it did so while it treated in slavery and then colonialism and imperialism and all of that. So he says, how do we expose the hypocrisy of the West? He argues the intellectual arguments and the works of professors and Noam Chomsky and the like are all no use. They're never going to educate anyone. They're never going to change anything. We must force the West to maximize its forces of repression. So basically to internally combust their democratic orders and their humanistic talk and their talk about human rights. And he admits in his text, he says, yeah, we know that this will result. He's happy about the prospect of concentration camps for Muslims in Western countries because it says nothing will galvanize Muslims. Sure, a few million Muslims will be exterminated in Western countries, but what we'll gain is much more. That all Muslims will unite, all Muslims will realize that the West is the enemy. And he says only after these two necessary steps, that war of attrition that exhausts the resources of the West, second, that exposing the Western hypocrisy, will then Muslims' consciousness start to change and no longer remain in what he sees as a state of appeasement and complete subservience. So they'll basically be joining ISIS by the drones. They'll just come in the millions. And then we will build a civilization again. And now, he never gets to talking about, well, what is that Islamic civilization supposed to stand for? I mean, okay, so you want to restore Islamic civilization. What should it do? What is your theological perspective about the civilization? He just doesn't really get to any of that. He just says that important thing is power, is that we must regain, and that the West learned that lesson. The West learned to talk, in terms of principles and ethics, but to act in terms of power, and learn and to give when it comes to where it makes a difference, it's realpolitik, political realism. Do what it takes, but in their own societies, they go around talking nice principles that they all feel good about. Now, if I could, I wouldn't hide this text. I would propagate it everywhere, because it exactly exposes what, and I actually published this. I mean, this is not something that I've published this in several places. It exactly says what ISIS short-term and long-term and overall program is. It does not worry about all these apocalyptic visions about Messiah returning, or there's very little about the Messiah returning, or all of that stuff that people have written. It's nonsense. And from that, I mean, basically, that is used as a recruitment tool, because they come to this, kid who's from a dysfunctional family, who's truly a loser, and they say, do you want to be among the great builders, to be remembered as a great martyr in the story of recreating Muslim consciousness, uniting Muslims, bringing back our glory days, when the Europe was in the Dark Ages and the Muslim world was in its enlightened state, and the rulers of the world and so on and so forth. Yes, how can I do that? Well, you must become a soldier and do your duty in this war of attrition. That's why ISIS is happy with any act of violence it can loosely attach any type of connection with. So if I tomorrow go do something and I say I've done it in ISIS' name, they will be more than happy to take credit for it because it's a part of selling the idea that here we are engaging in a war of attrition. Our soldiers are making the enemy fight everywhere. They don't know where the next blow is going to come from. But it creates a very ridiculously diffuse situation where people who what can I say? People who every type of individual was a social uprootedness with no prospects. I mean, as we know that if you look at the number of people who try to immigrate to the U.S. or to the Western countries, the number of people who perish, and this ISIS uses this as well. You know, say the number of people who perish in the Mediterranean or in the Red Sea, trying to get from Morocco or somewhere in North Africa or Libya or Egypt or whatnot to Europe. What for? So they can work at lower than the minimum wage, ridiculous amount of hours, just for the hope of upward mobility. That tells you that within many of the countries that they come from, there's no chance of upward mobility. I mean, the oligarchy that controls power in a country like Egypt is so corrupt, so in bed with other corrupt rich people. In the case of Egypt, for instance, so in bed with American and European businessmen, and that the interests intersect, that a poor, a destitute individual or individual has socially uprooted or without prospects, truly is out of the ballgame. And they say, instead of look at how many people drown pointlessly every day trying to cross the ocean. Well, why don't you make your death meaningful? Why don't you make your death not a meaningless act in which God will say, why did you kill yourself for no point whatsoever, in which you've left this ugly world and you've gained paradise? They of course, they sweeten the pie, the term that they use in the intelligence community, the honey pot. What is it? Honey pot, or there are different honey pot things. If you, for instance, you're an individual, no chance that you'll ever get married because you don't have money. You can't afford to even rent a place, and so they'll, if you join, they'll give you a honeymoon. They have a lot of women who, through patriarchy and ideological brainwashing, they control. And they say, we'll give you a year with this woman where you can have a lot of sex instead of being sexually frustrated forever because you have no chance of ever getting married, or instead of sleeping with prostitutes and so on and being a sinner and going to hell, you get to have sex, go to heaven, get it all. It's critical, I think, that we understand that it's not that ISIS has made a secret of its methodology or its program, or in fact the most remarkable thing is that they have a newsletter which, again, legally speaking is banned, but it's easily accessible, that they publish in English and French and German and Dutch and several languages, and they send out, it was monthly, I don't know, still monthly, that basically what it is translations from main texts like the Abu Musab al-Suri a translation of excerpts. And so that's how that idea of panencepalism plays in. Does everyone who is recruited by ISIS understand? They understand as far as my brother, because there's so many. Okay, consider this: Sisi today, who is clearly in bed, who rules Egypt. He's clearly supported by the Pentagon, supported by the CIA, supported by Israel, supported by Saudi Arabia. Even Europe has refrained from condemning his human rights abuses. He's managed to even European countries were the ones who actively blocked attempts by human rights activists to get him any types of charges filed against him by the International Court of Human Rights, International Criminal Court, sorry, or even charges before the European International Courts of Human Rights, so that he can't just travel freely in Europe. This guy slaughtered 4,000 Egyptians in over the span of a week in an area called Abbasiyah. Currently, 50,000 Egyptian political prisoners. The most savage methods of torture on a daily basis, has banned all types of. The number of Egyptians that you can find that live in these little mud shacks in the outskirts of Cairo, in the middle of these high rises or next to these high rises, and in the middle, you see these very expensive Mercedes Benz and so on driving, and these people don't even have running water, don't even have toilets that function, or even toilets, period. And every family has members, brothers, sisters, cousins that have either been taken by the political police and disappeared, or were killed during the demonstrations. And if they attempt to do anything, they know that the political police is extremely powerful, and it is so clear that the choppers they fly, the military gear they wear, the military armed cars they drive, and same for Saudi Arabia, same for the Emirates, same for Bahrain, same for you name it, are all made in various European countries. Some say made in America, some say made in Germany, some say made in Britain. But regardless, and you know that these governments are there through the sheer ability of coercion. You can understand how you can come and you can recruit someone like that with a little bit of money, a little bit of ideological washing, a little bit of thrills, whatever the thrills are, whatever gets them high, basically, sex, drugs, alcohol, whatever it is, and and off they go. And that's why I think counterterrorism must be vigilant in terms of surveillance. Yes, you must have strong penal laws that say we will not tolerate someone killing people haphazardly. But you must, in addition to that, look at your policies that create a recruitable mass. You must get to the grassroots. It's like trying to solve urban poverty or urban decay with strong penal laws. And strong police forces. If you don't attempt to address why do kids get pulled in gangs in the first place, all that will happen is that you'll fill your prisons with more and more and more people, and you might know that the U.S. is the first, percentage-wise, is the country first in the world in terms of the percentage of its population in prisons, and legally, in not in any, not Guantanamo-like prisons, but it means we have predominantly an enforcement-minded system of law, but very weak social policy. So we're very strong on legal punitive policy, but very weak on social policy. And I think in the field of counterterrorism, we confront the same type of predicament. We're very strong in send in the grunts, kill the bad guys. We can now kill people from remarkable heights. But we are very bad in terms of policies that create more and more recruitable material for these groups. And so there are much more in terms of population-wise that is recruitable today than there were in the 70s, for instance. And it's not despite our policies. It's in part, not totally, because of our policies. Some people don't like to, they don't want to talk about policies. They don't want to talk about our foreign policies or any policy. They just want to talk about retaliation. And what I say is, it's like when the French and the Russians were bombing in Syria. ISIS made its greatest military advancements on the ground during these bombings, because a lot of people who were getting killed, they're having their families killed accidentally, were joining ISIS, and were turning territories over to them. And to my God, that's just insane. That's nuts. We talk about surgical strikes all the time, but if people just bother to read the memoirs of the military, including the chief of the highest ranking general in Iraq, who wrote a book about the U.S. campaign in Iraq, and what they say about the true nature of surgical and precision strikes, and they tell you they're actually not surgical at all, and they're not precision at all, because we have to rely on intelligence on the ground. And you know what? People give us intelligence for all types of reasons. They want our money, and they want to liquidate their neighbor or their competitor, or the woman who refused to marry them, this is just a fact of life. But there are concrete results on the ground. And here, I think, quite frankly, now what percentage of the Muslim population